What professional sort of exhibitor dahlia growers do is they do cuttings every year. So actually I'm going to lift my tubers, dry my tubers, and then use them for cuttings next year, and then throw the tuber away, which is controversial.
Yeah, that's what all the exhibition growers do. They only grow from, you will get the best quality blooms, the largest heads, the most intense colours from rooted cuttings.
So I've grown dahlias for absolutely years and years and years. Who hasn't? And I do absolutely adore them. But I also knew that there was one person that if I wanted to learn more about dahlias, then Philippa was the only person in the world that I wanted to talk to. She's called Just Dahlias because she just does dahlias. And I was so thrilled when I went to a Flowers from the Farm event, a few weeks ago now, that I found myself sitting next to her watching Shane Connolly and Polly Nicholson making their arrangements. And the first thing I said to her after introducing myself was to say, could she come and talk to you and me in Gather and help us understand a bit more about how to grow these absolutely wonderful flowers. And she was an absolute font of knowledge, so much so that I had to break up all of the interview into lots of different pieces so that we could make the most of all her expertise. And so here she is, Philippa Stewart of Just Dahlias, telling us all she knows about these wonderful flowers.
So, hello. Thank you very much to Philippa for being here with a very special Dahlia Q&A. And I have to say, I did ask quite a few times for Gather members to put forward their questions because I knew there would be loads, and there were loads. Lots of them there was overlap because I think most people want to know about how to overwinter, but this season has thrown up a few questions about foliage and flowers and how to really get the most out of your plants as well. So I have a clipboard and I have some questions, and I think we're going to start with Charlotte. So I wondered if you could ask Philippa about overwintering dahlias, because I lose several every year. I've tried mulching and leaving them outside, and I've tried lifting them, but both end up with losses. The main problem is that once I've realised that they've died, it's too late to restock, and my dreams of copious late summer blooms are dashed. I love dahlias and I don't want to give up on them. Any advice appreciated? What are your thoughts?
Okay, well, I would say if you're going to overwinter your dahlias in the ground, you really need to consider what kind of ground you've got. So here in Cheshire, I'm on heavy clay, and my soil is wet and heavy over the winter. So dahlias can handle the cold, but they can't handle sitting in cold and wet. That's just, they would just go to mush. I once tried to overwinter some in one of my greenhouses, in the ground, in the greenhouse. So obviously they weren't going to get any water over but there would have been natural ground seepage as well. But I found they were just puny the next year. They were absolutely awful. And for me, actually, I love the digging up bit. It's a bit like Harvest Festival. I'm definitely a below ground person. I love seeing how much growth the tubers have put on over the year, and it's fascinating. Sometimes the biggest plant can have the tiniest tuber, and the smallest plant can have the biggest tuber. I had a seedling last year which put on a tuber that was about this big. It was enormous. So I do like that bit. The trick then, what I do is I take those. I've got a large shed which I take the plants. I've cut the foliage down to about 10 inches, attached my label to the stalk. I've already been round yesterday making sure now is the time to put your labels next to your plant and make sure it's right near the base of that particular plant, so that you know you've got the right label on each particular tuber.
I have to say, I'm usually quite remiss at labelling. It's not my forte, but I did put this in the Gather newsletter this week that I had plastic labels cut out of milk bottles and cut a hole in there, and I wired them to the plant because my labels go everywhere. So yes, that is absolutely a job for right now before the flowers go.
Yeah, yeah. Well, once as I say, I cut the foliage down to about 10 inches and then attach the label to the stem. I use a rubber band. And then I take them to the shed and I lean them up against anything, the side of the shed, pieces of wood, old kitchen cupboards, anything I've got, so that they're at an angle, so that the moisture can drain out of the stalk. And I leave them like that for 2 or 3 weeks. So I'm wondering whether, was it Charlotte who asked the question?
Yes, it was.
I'm wondering whether Charlotte's allowed enough time for the moisture to drain out of the tuber, because that can sometimes lead to rot inside. I don't know any of the technical terms. I do most of my growing by feel and by just what works for me. And there is a saying in Dahlia world that, you know, if it works for you, stick with it. So that all I can tell you is what I do and works for me. So I'll leave them like that. Oh, so go.
Do you wash them? Because I know that's a bit controversial. Some people wash all the soil off, and some people feel like the soil gives them protection.
Yeah, no, that I was told that if you wash the soil, that a thin layer of soil leaves like a bacterial coating around the tuber to help keep them healthy. So I never wash them. After they've dried out for usually about 3 weeks, so I'm usually doing this job at the beginning of end of November, beginning of December, I will wriggle off as much soil as I possibly can from the tuber. I'll trim off any straggly bits of root. I reduce the stems down to about just long enough to be able to attach the label to, basically. And then I store them in banana boxes in wood shavings. And the wood shavings I buy in big bales from my local farm supply shop. And the banana boxes I get from my local supermarket. And then they go from there into a frost-free outbuilding. And it's not a huge room. I find I've usually got between 42 and 45 banana boxes of dahlias, and that gives me roughly 550 plants. So it's not a huge, and if you saw the room, it's not a massive room. I have deep shelves, and I stack them two boxes high on the shelves. So yeah, and that room is cold and damp. And I feel that I don't divide in the winter, because I think that they overwinter better as a big clump, because they're all huddled together, and they won't dry out too much. So it's a balance between not too wet and not too dry. And in this cold, damp outbuilding that never goes below freezing, I find it's perfect conditions. And when I get the box out in the spring, the box almost feels a bit damp. It's like the dahlias have been able to breathe. So, and the sawdust I've seen in some American, please don't judge by what the Americans do, because they have much drier winters than we do. So it's a completely different set of criteria for them. You know, I've seen American growers that water their sawdust. Well, I wouldn't do that. I've never had the need to do that. And generally, I find when I get them out in the spring, I do nothing. I don't look at them. I don't go and check them over the winter. I'm quite glad to have 3 months off at that stage. And then I just get them out in March. And that's usually, they look exactly the same as when I put them in the box. And that's when I'll do my dividing. So, but if you're overwintering in the ground, I can't talk too much on this because I don't do it, because I have such heavy clay. But my father has with some of his. Now he's on sand at the seaside, so he's got very good drainage. They tend to have much milder winters. But as I say, it's not so much the cold that gets them, it's the wet. So he'll put like a bucket of grass cuttings over the top of the dahlia to just act as a bit of a duvet for them, and just leave them over winter like that. But if you do that, that's fine. And if it works for you, that's great. So you could do a bit of an experiment. You could leave a couple in and see how they went. But I would recommend dividing them every 2 or 3 years, because if you don't divide dahlias, I was told you'll get increasing amounts of foliage and smaller and poorer quality blooms. Now, again, I can't speak from experience because I've never not divided them. I love the whole process of digging up, much prefer it to the planting, actually. It's like Harvest Festival, as I say, so I like that stage. But yeah,
can I interrupt you there, because actually the next question from Karen is actually about that, because what she wants is smaller flowers. So Karen said, I was wondering if you could ask Philippa whether leaving dahlias in the ground over winter for several seasons will result in smaller size blooms. I have too many dinner plate dahlias that I struggle to work into my smaller bouquets. They're fabulous for large arrangements and weddings, and I wouldn't want to be without them. But I was wondering if the size of the blooms will get smaller if I leave them in the ground for their tubers to multiply over several seasons. So What do we think?
Well, again, I've never done it. I do find that I get my biggest blooms certainly on something like Cafe au lait, and I know exactly. Oh, sorry, what was the name of the lady?
Karen.
Karen. I completely agree with Karen. A lot of my customers, when the Cafe au lait are massive, they how can you put that into a bouquet? It just doesn't work. So they much prefer it as the season goes on. Like now, they're getting smaller and they're much more manageable. And as I said to you earlier, that I do have one customer who even likes them before they're fully open. She likes that, that they almost look like origami at that stage when they're just unfurling. They are beautiful. So as far as leaving them in the ground to force them to be smaller, I'm not sure how that would work, because I think what she'd end up with is masses of foliage, and maybe poor quality blooms rather than smaller blooms. What I would recommend that Karen does is look at alternative varieties. So something like Sweet Natalie, which is quite a similar colour to Cafe au lait. It's got slightly more pinky tinge in the back petals, but it's a much smaller head size, much more manageable in bouquets, or else to just grow them on and use them later on in the season, and dry the early ones, because a big dried head is lovely, but use the ones later on in the season.
Yeah.
But also it might be worth a go if she's got the space. That's what I love about Dahlias. You can have an experiment with lots of different things, and if she's got the space to leave something in the ground and see how it goes. As I said earlier, I did leave some Cafe au lait in the ground once, and I ended up digging them up in the spring because I couldn't understand why nothing was going on, and what was coming up were these really weedy stems, whereas normally with Cafe au lait you get broom handles, don't you, coming up. And these were really weedy, and they obviously didn't like being overwintered in the ground. So it depends on your soil conditions. You've got nice light drainage, perfect.
So I have overwintered my Cafe au laits last year, and I think the year before. And I find the colour is starting to go. They're much whiter, and they've lost that lovely twirly stuff. They're just a bit stiff. And so what Paul from Black Shed Flowers said to me is what professional sort of exhibitor dahlia growers do is they do cuttings every year. So actually I'm going to lift my tubers, dry my tubers, and then use them for cuttings next year, and then throw the tuber away, which is controversial.
Yeah, that's what all the exhibition growers do. They only grow from, you will get the best quality blooms, the largest heads, the most intense colours from rooted cuttings. I don't have the facilities to bring my tubers on under artificial conditions here, and I don't want to use artificial heat, so I only ever do cuttings if I want to increase stock, but otherwise they would flower too late in the season for me, with me being up north as well. But as you said earlier, you're a good 2 hours further south than me, so that would be a good way of regenerating the plant.
Yeah, and I'm also I do have just a really simple heat mat. It's not very big. It's sort of about half the size of my kitchen table. It's quite narrow, and I am going to start a lot of perennials in February. And then I was thinking actually that gives a bit of space in hopefully late March, that I'm going to put all my tubers out, which have been overwintered indoors, and then really start some cuttings from that. And just because I'm growing in lots of containers next year, because they're all moving to the front, which is exciting. But I do want to refresh just some of the plants and sort of try and get back to where they were. My suggestion for Karen, though, would also be, this is not the most sustainable solution, but we were talking earlier about Halls of Heddon, and they sell rooted cuttings, which are not very much money at all. And it's probably worth, if you are in that window about have they overwintered, are they safe, are they going to grow, just go and buy yourself 10 rooted cuttings from Halls of Heddon as a backup plan, because
absolutely,
I don't think you can ever have too many dahlias.
No, and those rooted cuttings, I think people don't always realise that rooted cuttings that you buy, my order will arrive in April, they will flower that season, and they will set tubers, and I'll have tubers from that.
They grow
that same
like
season.
Clappers, don't they? I mean, they are incredible. I mean, dahlias are incredible plants. So how fast they grow and how big they get, they are astonishing. Yeah. a quick question from Nancy, which is, I grow about 100 dahlias every year. This year, the plants seemed vigorous and grew to about 6 to 8 inches. Does that mean inches or feet? Does one inverted comma mean
feet?
Oh gosh, okay, grew to 6 to 8 feet. I'm very metric, I'm afraid. But the blossoms were small and getting smaller, and some of the buds were distorted. Was it because of the extreme heat?
Oh, well, you know, that's very interesting, because I found the extreme heat meant that I had smaller plants for longer. And then once the temperatures cooled down, now they're absolutely going bananas. You know, I'm not sure what I would recommend there. Did she mention whether she'd divided those or whether she'd left them in the ground?
No, she didn't. But I'm wondering about too much nitrogen. I'm wondering actually if that needs a soil test, because that much foliage and that height, but distorted flowering, I would suggest that potentially an amendment's been put on, or they've been top dressed with compost, which has got something in, that maybe there's something in the soil.
Yes, I think you might be right there, because I do watch, and again, I can't give you any, you know, algorithms or anything for it, but I just do it by feel. And I do watch how much I feed the dahlias, because otherwise I used to grow, well, I'd still grow a variety called Otto's Thrill, and it would get to 8 feet, but that was in the days when I used something called Miracle Grow, which I'm not sure. Actually, I've never really looked into what goes into Miracle Grow, but I sort of think it's not really the right thing to be using. And these days, I don't use that kind of thing. Otto's Thrill is 3 to 4 feet high, and I'm still getting lovely blooms from it. So yes, maybe it's been over fertilized, and you do want to watch that as well, because otherwise you end up with very weak stems rather than nice strong stems. And certainly autumn, you know, we're going to start having blustery winds, and you can end up with losing pots and half your plant from if the stems aren't strong enough.
Yeah. Sorry, a completely random question that we haven't talked about. Do you stake yours? Do you grow yours through mesh or?
Yes. So I put hedge laying posts down the length of the dahlia beds, and I buy sweet pea netting, or I think they call it P&B netting, and definitely the square cross section, not the diamond one. The diamond one it doesn't lie flat. It tends to concertina in. It's a nightmare. It ends up tangled. So you want the square section P&B netting, and I buy it in 20.
One or the juped one, because I've got the juped one, which is great.
Yes, I bought it 6 years ago now, so I admit it is plastic, but I take it up every winter and I roll it up and I put it in an outbuilding, so it doesn't spend the winter outside, and I've had 5 seasons out of it. So it's still very strong. And I stretch it between the hedge laying posts, and I have positioned my beds in the direction of the prevailing wind. So and the thing about the beds as well is that I've got them away from the hedges, because wind is fine if it's got somewhere to go. It's when it hits a barrier like a hedge that you get all the turbulence, and it's the turbulence that causes the most damage. So I put the dahlia beds in the direction of the prevailing wind, and with the P&B netting, because there's give in it, I find that the whole bed sort of sways when it's windy, and I get really minimal damage. Whereas if you had something rigid like sheep fencing, which is absolutely rigid, you're more likely to get heads snapping off. And actually, there's a fantastic word as well. When you bring your dahlias on in the greenhouse and then you harden them off outside, and hardening off is the thing that strengthens the stem. There's this wonderful word called thigmomorphogenesis, which is the action of the wind on the stems, which, you know, when you bring a plant out of the greenhouse, it's all a bit weedy, isn't it? And a bit, ugh. But once you've hardened it off, those stems really do get more and more rigid. So,
do you not stroke yours? I stroke my seedlings in the greenhouse because it mimics the wind movement and the air movement, and that triggers, you know, the strengthening of the stems. So we need to blow on them.
It's such a brilliant idea, isn't it? I just love that idea. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I'm terrible at hardening things off. It's yeah. Right, we have one more question, which is, Amanda, longest lasting dahlias for cut flowers and best dahlias for drying.
Okay, so the longest lasting ones for cut flowers, I would definitely recommend the ball varieties. So like the one that you've got there, Burlesca, I call it Newland Josephine, Cornell Bronze. What's that one that you've got there, Grace?
That one's Burlesca, and this
right.
This one looks a spitting image of a Cornell Bronze, but is actually the Mystery Fox one, Zunder.
Zunder Mystery Fox.
Yep.
Yes.
Is lovely. This is, now you've told me that they're meant to be 45 degrees from the stem, I'm very, very disappointed.
Yes.
This is a Cornell Red, which is really robust, and again has got this really beautiful detailing on the back. I love these ones dried, I have to say. I've got these as dried ones knocking around the place, and cliche, I know, I find cafe au lait dries beautifully.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they do. I've had
the same dried wreath up on my wall for about 3 years now, and it has one cafe au lait dahlia just tucked in. I'll post a picture, which to me just completes it. So
for vase life, I'd definitely go for the more this one here is Berolina, and it's actually a decorative. Again, I'm not always right on my classifications. I just like the flowers, but that one lasts well. So something with the ones that you're going to get the shortest vase life out of, but it's such a shame to discount them, is going to be the singles. But the trick to do with the singles is when you cut them, is to make sure that you cut them before they set pollen. So the setting pollen is like the trigger. Once the flower is set pollen, it thinks, right, I've done my job now. I can eject my petals. So if you see, this one has only partially set pollen. Can you see that on the camera?
Yeah.
So that one, you'll get more vase life out of it, rather than if the whole centre was completely furry with all the pollen on it. So that's a good tip as well.
I did say I wasn't going to turn this discussion into a "can you identify my dahlia for me?" But just talking about long-lasting ones, I have no idea what variety this was. I have had this for years and years and years and years and years. It's a really simple, beautiful apricot-y sort of blush colour, and it lasts forever, but I don't know what it is. Any idea what that is?
It looks a little bit like Dr. Caroline Rabbit, which I only bought for the colour, or maybe it's a bit too pale for that. My Dr. Caroline Rabbit, I would say it's a similar colour to this one, but much paler. So
this one has got paler because it was cut about 4 or 5 days ago, and that's how good it is. I mean, it looks exactly the same as when I cut it.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know what, I have no idea where it came from. But it is just, it's one of my absolute favorites. So, but I do think the smaller the head, you get that really nice, robust, like you can, I don't know, there's something, really strong about the smaller ones, I find. Can I just ask about, I'll put that there, about what stage you cut yours for drying? This is just a bud that was on a cafe au lait. The cafe au lait's buried in there somewhere. For drying, do you cut when they're fully ready, fully open? Like what stage of flowering? Because I think that might dry quite nicely.
Yeah, well, exactly. That's another thing, the joy of trying lots of different stages. But generally, I find I would cut for drying as the same way as I would cut for cutting. Yeah. So when the flower is fully open and before it's set pollen, because again, if I was drying this single, and singles do dry, but you've got more chance of the petals falling off if it's already set pollen. So before they've gone too open, but when they're,
I mean, my
but you'll find it if the head is too tightly closed, it will just shrivel to be an even more tightly closed head. Do you know what I mean? So it's finding the balance.
Yeah, I might have to experiment. So just going back to what you said about, that's maybe not the most, so I can see pollen. You can't quite see it on the camera. I can see the pollen inside this one. I mean, this is over because I often look at the back, and when it starts to sort of, this is not demonstrating anything I wanted to do. I thought the petals were going to fall out the back then, and they absolutely haven't. It's just I think these ones are a bit old, aren't they, for drying?
I think so. I think what you'd find, it would dry, but what would happen is the head would fall off the stem. That's what I found.
Ah, yes. Someone else asked me that, is how do you know which ones are going to just snap at the base, because they are brittle, aren't they, when you, and is it just that I should have done them a bit earlier?
Yeah, well, for the ball ones, that's what I find. I find if I'm drying them when that, because I like that yellow center, because it looks lovely when they're dried. But I often find that if I'll walk past some of the drying racks and think, oh, head's just popped off there. And the varieties as far as drying, again, you know, I've never had a problem with heads falling off cafe au lait, and they're one of the biggest heads that I dry. Blackjack, and it's got a massive head, mind you. It has got a very good sturdy connection to the stem, but that dries magnificently. It's jet black when it's dried. It does have good strong stems, but I never have to wire that. There's one variety that I love it when it's dried, but often the heads fall off. And I think you can only do that by experience. And what I do with that one, because it's very popular with my customers, I actually wire it when it's fresh before I hang it up. So just use half a piece of stud wire, wire it on. As my husband says, the amount of time and effort that goes into these, they should be about £25 a stem. But seeing as most people do it for the love of it, it's absolutely fine.
Well, I have to say, the day, I think it was maybe the day after I met you at Strawberry Hill House, I came home and my husband and I watched Gardener's World. And my husband loves Gardener's World. He's not a gardener at all, but he loves Gardener's World. And your feature on Gardener's World, and the camera just went through your house and there was just dahlias everywhere. And he looked so horrified. He was like, "You're not going to do that, are you?" I was like, "Well, I might do." Because your house.
I had one photographer come around the house and he just kept walking around going, "My wife would never put up with this." But that all started in lockdown because obviously that summer, all the weddings were cancelled. I'd already started drying. I had, as sod's law, you know, it was my best flowering season yet. So I had hundreds of flowers. My children couldn't come home because they were living abroad at the time. So they weren't. So I just commandeered their bedrooms, their bathroom, the landing, the sitting room. Nigel doesn't mind. I keep saying this. He's always said, as long as I can see the telly, I don't mind. And he even says, by the time I've sold them all, oh, it looks quite bare without them. So
yeah, you get used to them, don't you? Well, I have to say, I'm going to go outside right now and I'm going to cut my next load, because I did a big cut probably a week ago, which has triggered lots of new flowers. So they're all looking much healthier actually for the big cuts. And I'm going to string some up over the, I've got a really big inglenook with a sort of mantelpiece, which I've got some steel underneath, and I'm going to hang loads of dahlias off that.
Yeah, brilliant.
And I'm feeling very inspired to go and plant yet more dahlias and order lots more for next year. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Okay. Thank you very much. It was great fun, Grace.